So low light photography, that's what we're going to talk about tonight, of course, which basically is looking at hopefully this kind of view of Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol at dusk. It's always a popular kind of thing to photograph, mostly in the evening because it looks so much nicer then. And when we talk about low light photography, we're really talking about photography from sunset through to sunrise. Though also it can, in my mind, it also includes photography during the daytime in very stormy conditions when the light levels can be quite low. So I have a little bit about that this evening, about photography in stormy conditions, but mostly it's going to be talking about photography between sunset and sunrise, so basically at night. Now, we're talking, obviously that covers largely photography at dawn, sunrise, sunset, and dusk. Now, a lot of people tend to think of sunrise and dawn as being at the same event, and also think of sunset and dusk as being the same event, but actually they're quite separate things. The dusk and sunrise, they're really quite separate things, and different things go on, and they have different quality light and so on at that time. And the same in the evening when you have sunset and dusk. They're quite separate events. In the temperate zone, so say in the UK, sunset and dusk can be separated by as much as 30 or 45 minutes. So they're really quite distinct. If you're in the tropics, then you can go from full daylight through to complete darkness in as little as 15 or 20 minutes. So they're not separated by anything like as much time. It all happens very, very quickly. But here in the UK, they're separated by quite a bit of time, so you need to sort of think of them as two events. Someone's got their microphone on. Can they turn their microphone off? Sounds like the TV's going or something. See if I sort of mute everybody. But yeah. Anyway, so that's what we're kind of looking at with low light photography. And this look initially at stormy weather. This actually is stormy weather towards the end of the day when light levels are really falling away quite significantly. Just a very long exposure. This one actually is 3.2 seconds with the lens aperture closed right down at f/22. So you have a very atmospheric, very moody kind of shot, and a very simple landscape where the water has completely blurred out. So you have this very simple composition of the rocks being the subject, and then the water blurring out, forming sort of the backdrop to it. And this is the kind of thing that you might take in very poor lighting conditions in stormy weather, so that you really just have sort of a really nice exposure, but with long shutter time, long exposure time, let's say 3.2 seconds in the case of this one. And you can see also in this shot that there really is no sky at all, and that's often what I recommend for people when the sky is just rather grey and dull, doesn't contribute much to the picture. It's often best to shoot a detail that doesn't include any sky. However, there are occasions when you will want to shoot with sky in a picture, often when it's a dramatic stormy sky, and in this instance that's what we have here, quite a stormy sky going, enhanced really by the use of a neutral density graduated filter, which has darkened the top half of the picture, really showing up that cloud pattern, and enabled us to get sort of enhance the sky and mix it with a fairly stormy sea using a slow shutter speed. Actually, that's 1/4 of a second with the waves crashing against the rocks. So this is in quite low light conditions in fairly stormy weather. I think late one afternoon. I think some of you have probably seen this picture before, but it's something I often show around to people as an idea of stormy-ish kind of photography. And then another kind of stormy photography, the sun could actually be shining in its own little way. Very low in the sky just before sunset. So really looking into quite bright light, but nevertheless very stormy low light conditions. And this is a 1/6 of a second, again, f/22. So the lens aperture closed down very narrow. So you've got a big depth of field. That is, the whole picture is sharp from right in front of the camera all the way through to the horizon and the sky beyond. And so slow shutter speed, and just the light really only in the sun there. Everything else is really quite dark. So that's just a very sort of brief summary really of the kind of low light photography you might have in stormy conditions, especially if you're getting towards the end of the day when the light levels really are falling off. But as I said already, for the great majority of the time when we're talking about low light photography, we're talking about shooting between sunset and sunrise the next day. So basically at night and early morning and late evening. This one is dawn, as you might guess, and the reason you might guess it is because of the mist over the sort of on the ground. You don't get ground mist very often in the evening at sunset. Occasionally you do if the conditions are absolutely perfect, but usually you see it early in the morning. So the early bird catches the worm. If you want to get shots like this with mist in or ground mist in, you usually have to do it at dawn, not in the evening. It's you get very lucky to get this kind of thing in the evening. This is a shot taken in the Somerset Levels. Taken, I say, very early in the morning, I think in May or thereabouts, and on a clear morning when we've got beautiful red sky coming up above the mist. Predicting when you're going to get these conditions is, of course, a large part of the skill with low light photography, because it's getting yourself in the right place at the right time. There is a lot of luck involved, but in terms of finding or predicting when you're going to get early morning ground mist, you kind of look at the weather conditions you've had. So if you've had heavy rain, or if you've got flooding or a landscape where there's a lot of water anyway, such as the Somerset Levels, and the ground is wet, and if it's has been fairly warm, so the ground is a little bit warm, but then you have a clear, cold night and completely still with no wind, then you've got a reasonable chance of having this kind of ground mist, because the warmer water tries to evaporate off the ground, but then hits all this cold air and immediately condenses again, because of course cold air can't hold anything like as much moisture as warm air can. And so you get this thin layer of mist hanging just above the ground. Of course, that disperses very quickly once the sun comes up, because the sun then warms the air above that water, and the water then is able to evaporate off, or at least to mix in with the air, and so no longer form as mist. So that's kind of a sort of one of the ways to actually try to predict when you're going to get these conditions, because obviously you don't want to go getting out of bed at 4 in the morning and driving an hour to a location only to have the conditions far from what you would like them to be. So another dawn shot is when you've got completely clear weather. This is photographed at Porthgwara on the west coast of Cornwall, just at dawn, about half an hour or so before sunrise, and just again a long exposure. This is actually 13 seconds, so it's really quite dark. It doesn't look it in this picture, but it is still quite dark, and so the sea is completely blurred out as a result of this long exposure. Now, if in the previous shot we had a lot of mist, so the air is not completely clear, even though we managed to get above the mist. Here the air is completely clear, and if I were to point the camera straight into where the sun is going to rise, even though the sun is still a long way below the horizon, the horizon is incredibly bright, much brighter than the land or landscape all around me, and much brighter than much of the sky too. So it becomes really difficult to execute a really workable photograph. So you may then find yourself wanting to actually, or needing really, to point the camera away from that eastern sky and look at something else. And that's what I've done here. I'm actually looking southwards, and I think you can see that you've got in the sky, the light is getting brighter towards the left here. And on the rocks, you can see there's a little bit of shadow there and brightness there. So the light from the dawn is coming in from the left of the picture. So the east is off to the left, and I'm pointing the camera to the south. And the reason I'm doing that is because the sky towards the east is just so bright. It's far brighter than the landscape. And I can't, even with the use of neutral density graduated filters, I can't bring that light down enough to actually get a workable exposure. So I've angled the camera away a bit and photographed something else. So that's one way of managing the conditions when you've got really bright, clear dawn. And then we come to the sunrise. Now, I very rarely photograph actually just sunrise or sunset by themselves, because basically the rising sun or the setting sun they get a little bit boring after a while. It's always not exactly the same, but it's really just an orange ball coming up. It's what you photograph with it that really makes the picture. And so I always like to photograph the rising or setting sun with a really interesting composition to actually make the mood and set the scene. In this instance, it's Lanyon Quoit, which is a prehistoric burial chamber in the far west of Cornwall, photographed literally in a minute or two after the sun has risen above the horizon. Managed to shoot it without, although only looking straight into the sun there, you can see I've managed to shoot it without the rocks being a complete silhouette. So I've actually managed to have some light going into the rocks. So we got a nice composition there, very dramatic scene. And I've done it in this way partly because I wanted to sort of give the idea of, well, these set of rocks have been standing here for 3,000 years. How many sunrises like this have these rocks seen? It's kind of it's a very ephemeral moment, the sun rising above the horizon. It only lasts for a few minutes, and then it's really no longer sunrise. And yet this is a scene with these rocks here that's been lasting several thousand years. So it's a timeless scene, and yet also at the same time a really ephemeral scene. And I wanted to combine those two elements into one frame, and hopefully that's what I've achieved with this picture. I deliberately didn't want these rocks to be a silhouette because it would be a really big solid block of black if I did that, and it really would not work terribly well as a silhouette. It'd be just too much solid blackness. And if you're going to have a silhouette, you need to have it's going to be all about the outline and really have a nice, interesting shape without too much solid blackness in it. So when you do have a silhouette, as in the next picture, then it's got to be a really nice outline that doesn't take up too much of the frame, but really gives you some beautiful subject in the picture, which really sets the scene and gives you the atmosphere. This shot, we've gone to the other end of the day now, and it's sunset. And again, didn't want to photograph just the setting sun. I want to have a really nice composition in this. So I picked out this time silhouette of these 6 trees. And I really love this picture. Some of you have almost certainly seen it before because I do show it off quite often. Because for me, this picture really sort of personifies the simplicity that I really aim for in my compositions. Okay, admittedly, you might say, well, there are 6 independent subjects, which is always can be a bit of a problem. You want to have a single subject, but in my mind, these 6 trees actually form a single subject, just this line of silhouettes against the setting sun. So one of the important things here is actually the strength of the sun as it's going down. I've managed to photograph the composition with the disk of the sun actually visible, which actually is not always easy. Sometimes it completely burns out and you just have this mass of light there. And other times you have this red ball, which is actually really quite nice as well. And so you have to try and work out a way of predicting what kind of sunset you're going to get, whether it's going to be an attractive atmospheric sunset or whether it's going to be too strong. Janice, if you've just joined, can you turn your microphone off if you've just joined? So you want to have a sunset where the light is not so strong that it's going to overwhelm the camera. You want to have a nice red or orange disc in the scene which the camera can cope with. And that's partly what we've got here. It's quite bright, but basically you want a situation where the sky is not completely clear, because in those situations you will have the light overwhelmed, or have the camera overwhelmed by the light. You want a situation where there is some dust or water vapor in the air that will filter the sunlight, and so weaken its power a little bit, and then enable the camera to cope with that light. Not always easy to predict, but basically during the day before you head towards the sunset, you need to sort of try and look out to see how much sort of haze there is in the air. There's just not enough haze if it's just too clear for it to work, or if you've got really too much haze so you can hardly see the sun at all, then you may well decide that you're not going to get a great sunset. Of course, if you've got situations where the light is too bright, where it's too clear and you really can't point the camera towards the sun, then you may actually want to do a sunset shot where you're actually photographing something else and angling the camera away from the sun and just concentrate on the nice light that's falling on that subject. So you have a nice orange golden light falling on the subject, which is something that we have in the next picture. And those of you that have a copy of my book, Wild Southwest, will recognize this shot because it's used almost double page in the book. It shows the coast at Kilve on the coast of Somerset, and taken just literally about 10 minutes before sunset. So the sun is really, really low in the sky. Off to the left of the picture, it's really quite a golden light, and really you can see how low the sun is. It's really picking up the the spray in the water here, and just or the spray in the water is picking up the sunlight, perhaps I should say, and really showing off here. And on the pebbles, we've got really strong shadows. So the light is really coming in very low across the water and hitting these rocks here, and also hitting the cliffs, of course, and really illuminating the cliffs with this beautiful golden, rich red light, which is what we aim to have in what was called, of course, the golden hour and the final hour before sunset. This one literally about 15 minutes before sunset. So good strong colors and quite strong shadows as well, but a very atmospheric and moody shot. Slowish shutter speed, actually 0.4 of a second, so that's why we've got the blurred water here on the waves hitting the rocks. And if we look at the next shot, which is basically a comparison taken about half an hour later, it's about 20 minutes after sunset. I'm not standing in quite the same position, unfortunately, but nevertheless, it's a very similar composition. And you see that the whole atmosphere and mood has really changed. The light on the cliff is quite flat, and on the pebbles, it's very flat as well. But nevertheless, it's quite atmospheric. We've got some nice red in the sky. The light on the water is very flat as well. So the whole light is very flat. It kind of implies that it's rather dull and uninteresting, but perhaps I should say soft. That's actually more what I perhaps I ought to say. And that's really quite attractive. And it's very, very nice warm glow in the sky. So say taking 15 or 20 minutes after the sun has set. So the sun is below the horizon, but it's shining up and reflecting off the clouds that are in the sky. And so the clouds over here are still able to see the sun, and the sunlight is reflecting off the bottom of these clouds here and then projecting towards us, so we can see that red glow there. So that's quite a different kind of shot, taken 20 minutes after sunset. I should say here actually that a number of times I see people pack up their cameras the moment the sun has dropped below the horizon. It's quite incredible. Really must never ever do that at sunset, because the best is still to come. When you get into dusk, half an hour later, you come into some beautiful light, and we'll show you some of those shots in a few minutes. So don't put your camera away the moment the sun has dropped below the horizon. And similarly in the morning as well, don't assume that you can only shoot just as the sun is coming above the horizon. Again, at dawn, you have some beautiful lights, beautiful violets and blues, as well as the pink coming up in the sky. So you really want to be able to shoot quite some time before the sun comes over the horizon at sunrise. So if sunrise is at 6 o'clock, then I'm afraid you've got to be on station by about 5 a.m. So that can make the mornings really pretty painful. So that's why we usually talk about sunset and dusk really, rather than dawn and sunrise, because the early morning can be a little bit too painful. Anyway, so another comparison of two similar shots, not identical unfortunately, but close-up landscape rather than distant landscape. Again, taken about 10 or 15 minutes before the sun actually sets. Looking over the sea once more. People who know my photography will know that water figures hugely in my shots, and so there's nearly always water. We've got sunlight reflecting off the cliff here, but also picking out the rocks and being caught by the water here with a sort of slowish shutter speed. It's 1 second, and the waves are getting blurred, but you can still see the waves, but they are starting to blur out. And the sunlight is catching on the edges of the rocks here and in the water as well. So you're really getting quite an atmospheric feeling of orange glow coming from the sunlight reflecting off these rocks, and the swirling of the waves in the water as well. Half an hour later, 20 minutes after the sun has set, you've got a very different kind of landscape. These rocks are actually just a few yards to the right of the ones you saw in the last picture. I can't prove it, you just have to believe me, I'm afraid. But this is where the sun is now well below the horizon, but you can see that there's still a lot of reddish glow, violet glow, not violet, but magenta glow and reddish glow in the scene. So which tells you there's still quite a lot of red light in the sky, even though the sun is below the horizon, and still quite a lot of light in the sky, full stop, because it's reflecting off these rocks. But much longer exposure time. This is now 10 seconds, so it's a lot darker than it was in the previous shot, and the water is completely blurred out. It gives you a very atmospheric shot. Very different kind of mood, very different kind of atmosphere from that previous picture, but one of which still works nevertheless. And so this is 20 minutes after sunset, so you really have to stick around. Don't pack up the moment the sun has gone below the horizon. Next shot, I'm going to digress slightly. Instead of looking down at the landscape, I'm going to look up into the sky. And remember, at sunset, or indeed at dusk as well, after the sun has set, just think about the clouds that are in the sky above you. They can have some beautiful colors and beautiful patterns up there reflecting the sunlight that the clouds can still see. So always pay attention to any clouds that might be above you. Of course, the clouds in the sky at sunset can also ruin your sunset photography, because if you get one cloud parked in just exactly the wrong place, that can really completely ruin your sunset photography. But then there's absolutely no way to predict that's going to happen. So that's one of the risks you just have to take when you're going to do sunset, or indeed of course sunrise photography as well. You just have to take your chances on that. But if you've got clouds up in the sky above you, and you've got the sun has set or is setting and is putting some really nice color across the clouds, then you can get some really nice patterns and nice colored patterns, which are really worth photographing. Anyway, so moving on back to dusk. We've left sunset behind and we're moving on into dusk. And then the timing of actually when to shoot during the dusk. Obviously the dusk is a continuous process. There's no one specific moment, unlike sunset. There's no one specific moment when you might say now's the time to shoot, or I should shoot in this particular spot. And it can take quite a bit of patience. And it's something that I'm not very good at, actually, is having patience, because you can have to wait maybe half an hour or so from the time the sun sets through to when you can have good light, or the right kind of light for the dusk photography. And it can be particularly critical when you're trying to combine it with man-made lighting as well. So if you're photographing a view of a town, such as we are here, the harbour at Brixham. And here we can see the sun has already set. Sun has set behind this hill, and it's already gone below the horizon as well. It's not very long after the sun is set, because, and I know that because we still have some pink in the sky. It's fading away. The pink is fading, it's true, but it's still not that long after sunset. It was an evening when we didn't actually get a lot of red in the sky, which is a little bit disappointing, but it's one of those things that happens. So it's quite, but we do have some there, quite attractive. It's quite atmospheric, but the view of the harbour and the town, not quite so fantastic. The man-made light's not showing up all that well. It's a little bit dark, not really quite working, not really jumping out at you. So, but if you wait another, say, 15 minutes, as we have in the next shot, then it looks really quite different. The man-made lighting is much more dominant. The sky has got a little bit darker, and then we've been able to, the contrast range between the sky and sort of the landscape is much less. And we're able to actually then really get a nice shot, where the man-made lighting really comes into its own. We have lost the pink sky, which is a bit of a shame, but that's sometimes that's a price worth paying for actually being able to get the man-made lighting coming up nicely. Once you've lost that pink light in the evening sky, what you then replace with, the only light you then have is blue, because well, red light is low energy and it comes to you only directly from the sun. Once the sunlight can no longer reach you directly, then you lose all the red. And what you then have is indirect light, so light that is bounced around and reflected off dust or water vapor that's in the atmosphere and so on. And that is high energy light, and that is always blue. So after you've lost the pink glow in the sky, then you're left with just blue and violet light. And so the sky goes through a period of being really quite an incredible blue and violet, and the same with the water. It's not going to be sort of a tropical kind of blue sea kind of blue. It's a very can be quite a somber blue, but can also be very rich and quite an interesting and atmospheric shot. And if you combine that blue with the reds and oranges of the man-made lighting, it can be really quite dramatic, quite effective. So this is the kind of thing you're trying to aim for all the time, is just finding the right balance between finding the right balance between the man-made lighting and the natural light there, and hitting that sweet spot between when there's still too much light in the sky and when it actually gets too dark. I'll come on to being too dark just now. The view of Torquay Harbour at dusk. You do not really ever want to photograph an urban landscape, any kind of landscape really, once the sky has got completely dark, once you're really into the full nighttime. And you want to still have some light in the sky. And the reason for that is because when you've still got some light in the sky, you will pick out details like these apartments and the trees, and also including the pillars on the bridge here as well. They will really be picked out against the sky. If you wait for the sky to go completely dark, then all these things will start to merge back into blackness, and they won't stand out from each other. They'll just kind of merge in, and you might just about see the shape of the hill, but you may not even see the hill. You're just then completely dependent on the artificial lighting, and it really won't look quite so good. So best to make sure you photograph these things while there is still some light in the sky, and that's really quite a sort of a key thing to this kind of shooting at dusk. So I'm going to show you one more comparison now, which is the Shanghai skyline at dusk. I'm going to show you 3 shots. Obviously, Shanghai is much further south than we are, so this whole period from sunset through to dusk, through to complete darkness, happens much more quickly than it does here, probably less than half an hour. Yeah, actually about half an hour. So this is a first, first shot in the sequence, taken about 10-15 minutes after sunset. I'm already getting a bit impatient, getting fed up with hanging around. And you can see it's a reasonable shot of the skyline. The man-made lights are starting to come out. We've still got some nice light in the clouds in the sky, which is quite attractive. So it's kind of an okay sort of shot. When you come on to the next one, taken about 10 minutes later, you can see that actually it's got a good bit dark already, and the man-made lights are really starting to show up. But the buildings there's enough light for all the buildings to stand out separately from each other. We've still got some nice light in the clouds and in the sky. It really works quite nicely. And this is my favorite of the set. If we go on to the 3rd shot, you see now it's gone completely dark, and it doesn't work quite so well. It's still quite dramatic, but it doesn't work quite so well because the buildings are starting to merge together. You don't see the separateness of the buildings quite as well. Some of the buildings are even starting to merge into the sky a little bit, so not quite so great. The one thing that is working is this ghastly building here has now been lit up. This is actually, if I go back to the previous shot, you see here the post office tower as it is not lit up in the dusk shot. But if you go into the next shot, when it gets completely black, they then light up. This is a problem I have in China all the time, in Chinese cities, when you've got buildings that are illuminated externally, which ought to look great in a dusk shot if they are sort of lit up at dusk. It just doesn't work because in China they don't turn on those external illumination until it is actually completely dark, which is very frustrating for the photographer because you want to have that external illumination switched on while it's still dusk, and you can really capture the best of the whole scene. But oh well, can't have it all. But anyway, in this particular shot, I think that the sky is now too dark. It's just would have been just a shame really that although it's a horrible building and the light and the color is just ghastly. It would have been nicer if it'd been switched on a little bit earlier so I could have photographed it during the dusk. Anyway, so that's that set of shots. It's just going to show you a couple of other pictures now, just taken more locally than that one. Just show you the effect of shooting at dusk. This is in Exeter. So just a dusk shot taken in the city centre, and could actually be a fairly boring picture, just a department store taken, taken at dusk. There's still quite a lot of light in the sky here, looking over towards the west, but nevertheless it is starting to darken. It could be a very boring and very static shot, but I deliberately waited for a bus to go by with its lights and its blur. It is a 1 second exposure, so you've got this bus going by actually quite slowly, but it's given me a very nice dramatic high-speed blur, and that's had the effect of putting the sense of movement and dynamism into the picture, as well as some extra color and light. And it's also hid what would otherwise be a rather ugly road surface in the foreground. So it's actually coming out as a much more attractive picture. And then rather different shots of Sutton Harbour in Plymouth at dusk. One thing I forgot to say about the Brixham Harbour pictures, you notice with the boats in on their moorings, they will, when you start having long exposures, even though the boats look to be stationary, they will start to blur a bit because, of course, they're moving around on their moorings. But in this shot, even though it is 8 seconds, the boats have come out quite sharp, even the ones over on the left here. Of course, this great big boat here, it's rather a large boat, and it's very firmly moored, so it's not moving at all. So you have a nice sharp picture of this. Note the moon rising over there. It's almost full. It's a fairly minor part of the composition, but it's actually quite nice for the atmosphere. But it's come out as just a completely white disc, which is what you would expect to have in this kind of shot, because we're exposing for the main scene, not really for the moon. And the moon, of course, is much, much brighter than all the rest of this main scene. Quite a lot of blueness in the water and in the sky because it's a long time after sunset. it's well into the dusk, but that blueness is balanced quite nicely by the man-made lighting, the artificial lighting over on the harbour side here, which gives us quite a nice effect. Similarly, a shot in the Maldives, again taken quite some time after sunset. The sky is really blue, the water's really blue because of the sort of the indirect lighting. It's moving into darkness. Again, the moon rising rather larger in this frame, but nevertheless still a minor part of the composition and completely overexposed. It's just a white disc. And here then all the blueness is balanced quite nicely against the orange, yellow and reddish lighting of this canopy here on the end of this jetty. So we have a sort of a balance here between the blueness and the orange lighting, which I think is personally I think is quite attractive. On the other hand, we go to a shot which is almost completely blue because of the dusk light, not because of any sort of beautiful sunlight or anything, but just the dusk, taken maybe 30, 40 minutes after sunset. The entrance to the harbour at Lynmouth on the north coast of Devon. Just really getting very dark. It's only 2.5 second exposure, so it's not so long. f6.3, so the lens aperture is quite wide open. The only man-made lighting in this shot is the ship on the horizon. I haven't aimed to try and get the whole picture sharply in focus, so I've just used f6.3 just to give you a fairly shallow depth of field, and just focus on these posts. But I didn't want it too long in exposure because I wanted to be able to see the waves still. And so although it's 2.5 seconds, the waves are still partly visible. And it's a very, very simple composition, very moody, very atmospheric. Now I'm going to jump back just for a moment into sunlight. So taken about 45 minutes or so before sunset. The tin mine ruins on the cliffs at Batalic in the far west of Cornwall. And use camera on a tripod is one of the characteristic features of low light photography. Of course, you're always using your tripod. Not this is particularly low light, but I wanted to use a slow shutter speed in order to capture the movement of the waves and the surf, so really blur them out a little bit, so you have the sort of sense of energy and movement. So that's 0.8 of a second, but really got strong golden sunlight in the sort of golden hour, the final hour of daytime. Fast forward 2 hours, so we're nearly an hour after sunset. And we really have a very blue situation where the light it's very dark, very blue. This is a 25 second exposure at f8. So it's really getting quite dark, and you see the sea now is completely blurred out. And so the surf now is really just a white haze. And it's really quite atmospheric, quite dramatic, quite moody, but in a very different and very different way from the previous shot, which has its own drama and atmosphere, but in a very different shot, standing and shooting almost exactly the same view. And in fact, I think the original shot is even bluer than this. I've actually corrected some of the blueness out in order to get the walls of the mine looking at least vaguely sort of the right sort of what you might call the right color, but nevertheless the main shot is really main scene is very blue. So anyway, what would you then do once it's gone completely dark? Well, then you might go and photograph, if you're not going to photograph landscapes because the sky is completely black, you might go and photograph festivals or nightlife or night lights in the city. Well, in this instance, we're photographing the magnificent Bridgewater Carnival, which happens every November, of course, except when we have pandemics, of course, but every November, the incredible Bridgewater Carnival, this is what it looks like. And I'm shooting with a handheld. You can't really use a tripod in this kind of situation because there's too many people, everything's moving too fast. Nobody's going to thank you if you've got a tripod set up in the middle of the street with hundreds of people all around you. So you're shooting handheld and using a flash. And the reason flash is not so much because I'm a handheld, but because of the huge amount of lighting that is on these carnival floats, and there's enormous amounts of light shining straight at the camera. And if I were to shoot without the flash, then all these people on the float would just be rather dark, muddy. They wouldn't be silhouettes exactly, but they would look rather dark and muddy, and this wouldn't look great. So we fire a flash at the float, with the flash balancing its light against the power of the light coming back towards us from the float. In the olden days, 20 years ago, you would have to work out manually how to balance the amount of light coming from the flash to balance it with the light coming back towards you. But these days they do it all automatically, so it's really nice and easy to actually fire the right amount of light into the subject to balance it with the light that's coming towards the camera. So this is the kind of thing you might sort of go and do when it's completely dark. So this is, say, handheld 60th of a second f6.3, and it's, the ISO is 400. So I haven't actually had to crank up the ISO in order to be able to handhold it. And that's the sort of a testament to just how much light there is coming off these floats. So all really man-made light coming from the float, and then my camera flash as well to light up the people. Similar situation again, Bridgewater Carnival, different float, of course, but exactly the same scenario with huge amounts of light shining towards me, coming from the float, and then firing a flash straight at the float in order to light up the front of these people. Otherwise, these really would be almost silhouetted, these people. And I know that for a fact because a lot of the time the flash didn't fire and you ended up with rather dark, muddy people not looking that great. But this is the kind of thing that you can do. This was also, this was actually 125th per second. That's that much light coming off the float. A very different festival is Ottery Tar Barrels in Ottery St Mary, also held every November, hopefully. Fired with a flash, you see it shows up the festival quite nicely in a technically correct sort of way, but because it grabs just a fraction of a second of what goes on, it can actually end up looking a bit static. And those previous shots of Bridgewater Carnival also look rather static, because actually that's what they are rather static scenes. But this one, anybody who's ever been to Ottery Tar Barrels Festival will know it's an extremely dynamic scene, moving very fast, very fraught with energy. Something which is not captured in this shot, and that's because the flash firing from the camera has really caught just a fraction of a second of what's going on, and everything looks well exposed. You can see lots of people. You can see a shot which is not such a great idea necessarily for some instances, but it looks rather static. It doesn't really capture the mood or the atmosphere. Fortunately, as I already said, in this kind of situation, sometimes the flash doesn't fire. In fact, quite often the flash doesn't fire. The reason being that you're often shooting more quickly than the flash can actually regenerate its own power. And so you have to, often you'll get a shot where the flash doesn't fire off. And then in those situations, you may really don't know what you're going to get, but you can get something which can be very dramatic and very artistic. So that you get something like this then. Technically completely incorrect and a complete disaster in terms of technical stuff, but for the artistic and creative side of things, it's actually absolutely a dream. The previous shots would appeal to somebody who wants a technically correct shot that actually shows what's happening. For the artistic and creative eye, you might prefer something like this. I'm not saying one shot is wrong, the other one is right. It's just, it really depends on what you want and what you're trying to achieve. This for me is I prefer this kind of shot for myself because it really shows the energy and the drama and the activity of the picture. As a professional shot, excuse me, as a professional photographer, it also helps that actually none of the people are recognizable and none of the shops are recognizable either in the backdrop there. So that helps me as a professional photographer. But also from the creative point of view, this is actually a very dramatic and energy-filled picture, which really captures the mood of this particular festival. Anyway, so now we move on to fireworks. People often ask me, how on earth do you photograph fireworks displays? And say, well, that's actually quite a challenge. You really don't know what's going to happen. You just basically put the camera on a tripod, point the camera at where the fireworks are being let off, and start trying to shoot. Obviously, you can't really take exposure before the fireworks fire because they make such a huge difference to the lighting available that you don't know really what to expose for. So you get something like this very often, and this actually is a 15-second exposure. So I'm shooting quite long exposures, which is actually giving me reasonable lighting in much of the view. What the result, of course, is that the firework itself is massively overexposed, especially the center of it. But nevertheless, it gives me quite a dramatic atmospheric shot, which really shows off the firework display, which is in Plymouth, by the way. Another shot, also 15 seconds, really captures much more of the firework. The exposure is much more accurate. Only the central core of the firework explosions is overexposed, and that's really what you would expect. I'm trying to get the central core of the firework explosions correctly exposed would be like trying to expect to get the sun correctly exposed in the picture. It's really not going to happen. But basically, you really have to just sort of experiment with for firework photography. You really have to just put the camera on a tripod and just experiment and just keep on shooting long exposures Obviously, the great thing about a long exposure, say 15 seconds here, which is really pretty long, is if you've got multiple firework explosions going off over a period of several seconds, then you're going to capture them all. You end up with a shot which is really very dramatic, and actually probably more dramatic than what you actually saw while you were there. Also, great thing is you actually start to see some of the stars coming up as well. Despite the huge amount of light coming off the fireworks, you can still see some of the stars in the sky, which is really rather nice. Anyway, so then from there, we're going to move on from artificial lighting through to night sky. This is the final sort of section, just a few shots now of night sky and the moon. If you're photographing just sort of a crescent of the moon, then you're really just going to photograph it as a white sliver of light. But if you're photographing either the full moon here, or as you have here, 2/3 waxing moon, you really want to expose correctly for the moon. So the best way to do that is to do it actually at dusk, soon after the moon has risen, when the sky is not completely black, where there's still some light in the sky, and where the moon is not fantastically bright. Obviously, if you wait for it to get really dark, then you'll find that the moon is very, very bright and the sky very, very dark. So you've got big contrast range, and it's going to can be quite difficult to get the moon correctly exposed. You will find that you have to underexpose quite significantly, or you can use might be able to use spot metering to actually expose the moon correctly there. But basically, it's easier if you photograph it in dusk, at dusk, when there's still some light in the sky. You end up with this really rather nice deep blue of the dusk sky, and the moon with a still fairly gentle lighting. Looking at the details of this shot, I found that I didn't actually have to underexpose at all. So actually, the exposure is actually quite accurate if you're doing it at dusk. I got some fantastic detail in there altogether. And then we come on to night sky photography of the stars. Basically, there are two ways to do that. The first is to use very high ISO. This is photographed with 4000 ISO, so the sensor is very sensitive, and a relatively short exposure. This actually is 30 seconds, which perhaps is a little bit longer than I would like, really, with the lens aperture wide open, as far open as you can get. And then you end up with a lot of stars and pinpricks as pinpricks. If you go too long in exposure, and actually I would have thought that 30 seconds was too long, but it doesn't look too bad in this picture. If you go with too long exposure, because the stars are moving, they become no longer pinpricks, they actually become rectangles, and so that doesn't really look ideal. You really want them to be pinpricks of light rather than rectangles, so you really don't want your exposure to be too long. So you may have to put the ISO up pretty darn high, and as I say, in this instance it was 4000. Here you can see just how much interference, light pollution there can be. This actually is Barrowman's Nose, which many of you will know is in the heart of Dartmoor National Park. And even there, you can just see how much light pollution there was. And this is primarily from the village of Maniton. As those of you that know the village of Maniton will know, there really isn't a whole lot going on there, yet they still have a lot of light pollution coming off. So I was quite shocked by that, but that's kind of what can happen. Now, this picture is a single shot. And as some people will point out, you will have a problem with noise, which can end up creating a lot more white dots in the picture than there are actually stars. You should minimize the noise that you're getting by having both the high ISO noise reduction and the long exposure noise reduction facilities on your camera. Most cameras have both those options there switched on, so they will minimize the amount of noise. And then when if you process the pictures in the computer afterwards, then also reduce the noise in the post-photography processing as well. Other ways to do it, and which have become quite popular, is to actually shoot multiple pictures, all exposing correctly, and then blend them together in computer software such as Deep Sky Stacker, which works quite well. You can't just blend them together in Photoshop because, of course, the stars are moving, and it will show, and they won't actually merge together. All those different exposures won't merge the stars together into one spot. You have to use a software such as Deep Sky Stacker, which has a map of where the stars should be at any given time, and will actually blend the pictures together with the stars all put into the right place. That should reduce the noise still further, and also give you really accurate representation of the stars in the sky. The alternative is to use some hardware, which is a star tracker, which is a piece of kit which goes on top of your tripod with the camera on top of that, and it actually moves the camera at the same speed as the stars, and also the camera will track the stars as it goes through the sky, so you can keep on shooting the same stars with the stars in the same position in your frame as you go through it. Anyway, that's sort of one of the ways of shooting night sky where you have stars as pinpricks. The other way, of course, is to use a low ISO 100 and a very long exposure, in this instance 30 minutes, to actually produce star trails. And here we got Barrowman's nose again. I come in much closer and I've angled the camera really high up to get the pole star visible in the picture, and then we've got the stars rotating anti-clockwise around the pole star. And this is a 20-minute exposure, so you can see the length of the star trails. That's the amount that stars move in 20 minutes. And this is the kind of thing you can come up with. The one problem with this kind of shot is, well, firstly, it takes 20 minutes. But secondly, if you've got your long exposure noise reduction facility switched on, which you should have, then not only will it be a 20-minute exposure for the picture itself, then you'll have another 20-minute exposure by the camera just photographing its own sensor, not photographing the view, but photographing the sensor to actually get a shot of the noise that it's producing. So what you'll end up with is 20 minutes, a 20-minute shot will actually take you 40 minutes to produce. So you're not going to get too many shots of this type in a night, not even if you spend the whole night there, which is a little bit frustrating, but you can get some great results with a small number of images. Then we have one more shot showing the same kind of thing. The previous shot of Barrowman's nose showed Barrowman's nose completely black. That's because it was photographed with no moon. Here we have real coats on the north coast of Cornwall, photographed with a half moon shining behind me. And I've exposed the picture for 30 minutes, so the star trails are a little bit longer. And that 30 minutes exposure has just happened to have exposed the tin mine almost perfectly. So we have a really nice exposure of the mine, thanks to the moonlight exposed for 30 minutes, and then we got the star trails coming out quite nicely. So that also demonstrates that even when you've got the moon shining quite brightly in the sky, you can still get star trails. They will still come up. Also, you can still manage to get star trails with some cloud around. Along it is quite thin and high cloud, it will still work to some extent at least. And finally, just a very quick thing about the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis. Again, a scene photographed with moon in the sky, and the moon has correctly exposed this church. I preferred really to actually photograph these Northern Lights here with the landscape feature, but I couldn't get a decent, strong enough landscape feature in my foreground or midground, so I just put myself close to a very nearby feature, which was this church, and just used that as sort of an anchor point for the eye, and just had the Northern Lights going back across the top of them. This is a 13-second exposure. You don't want to have too long an exposure for Northern Lights because they are moving and changing all the time, and so you wouldn't want to have it completely, the pattern they're creating completely blurred out, which you would have if you had too long an exposure. Also, of course, if you had a really long exposure, then all the stars that are coming up quite nicely would become rectangles, and that really wouldn't look so great either. Also, in this instance, because there's a strong moon shining on a white church, obviously, if you have too long an exposure, then the church is going to burn out, amazingly, and that would not look wouldn't look good at all. But here we're just quite lucky, and we've got a really clear sky, and quite a strong Northern Lights as well to actually give us a really strong pattern, nice strong lighting there. Sometimes, although the last picture had a church in it, sometimes you really want to photograph just the pattern, and this is sort of fairly typical of some of the patterns you can see with Northern Lights. Also, it should be said that quite often, although this wasn't true of the previous shot, it is true of this shot. Very often, what you see with the eyes is quite different from what you can show up with image processing in the computer. So that you often see a lot less with the eye than the computer will actually produce when you're actually looking at processing the images. So in this, the original view, when they're looking at it on the ground, it was all green. All these magentas and reds that you can see coming up only came out when I started processing the picture in the computer afterwards. That doesn't mean to say that I'm sort of falsifying the picture. It just means that the colors just were not visible to the human eye. But when you separate out the colors in the in the computer afterwards, then they really all start to become visible. So yeah, it can end up with these very strong, quite colourful patterns, which are much more effective and have much more impact than what you saw with the eye on the ground. So that's really it for the Northern Lights, and also for this talk. Obviously, delighted if you wanted to come and see this for yourself on the Iceland tour in September, which I'm still hoping will be able to happen this September to Iceland. Hopefully we'll get some Northern Lights that people can see. So the final shot is the one I always show at the end, just to show you a reminder of the website, the books that I have for sale, and also that you can go there to photograph, to book your photography tour spaces and the tours, which obviously are going to happen this year, hopefully. And and then you can buy, let's say, the books, greetings cards, and prints. And then you can write reviews about my talks or the books or the courses you've been on, and you can watch recordings of the previous talks, and you'll be able to watch this talk on the website next week as well. And you can, of course, as you all know, register for future talks as well. So that's the end of that talk. As a whistle stop, as usual. I'm going to unshare my screen now, and if you have any questions, then please ask away. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, not end the show, but I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Okay, if you'd like to switch your microphones on, if you want to switch your cameras on as well, then please do. And if anybody has any questions, then please ask away. All blown your minds. Thanks, Finton, for your note. Finton Healy has written a note saying thanks for the talk. It's a very interesting, enjoyable talk. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, very good, Nigel. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's saying that? I can't see who's saying that.
That's me, Finton.
Oh, it is Finton. Okay. And Eleanor as well. Thanks from Eleanor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Good, thanks.
Yeah, it's Mike. Quick question, if I may.
Hi, Mike.
Yeah. Do you find that the camera calculates your exposure accurately for you, using your professional judgment a lot more? I was thinking particularly of the shot of the Ferris wheel over Torquay, where you had that big, and I think you said it was 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, generally I'm really using just the camera's exposure meter. I think 13 seconds at the exposure is for that shot of Torquay Harbour. Excuse me. But, generally, I'm using really just the camera's light meter, and obviously, if the picture doesn't come out right, then I can shoot again. Although, of course, at that time of day, it's getting dark quite rapidly, so can't shoot too many. And then, if necessary, if things do need tweaking, then I rely on the post photography processing in the computer to actually get things quite right. But yeah, you say you've got that bright white Ferris wheel there, and everything else is quite dark, so there is quite a contrast range there. But I think it works okay. I don't think I had to struggle with it at all. Anybody else? I've blown your minds. It's
Right, just one question with the lovely shot with the moon. What was your exposure on the moon?
Oh, that moon picture. That moon picture. Yeah, sorry, I didn't tell you that, did I? Let me see. That was 320th of a second f8 ISO of 400. So that was on a camera on a tripod. It was a 300mm lens. I had the camera on a tripod. I didn't want to use a slow shutter speed because, of course, the moon is moving all the time. So I wanted to make sure it's the right shape. And 320th of a second f8 400 ISO. So there clearly was quite a bit of light there as well. There's quite a lot of light coming from the moon, of course. Yeah.
Thank you.
How many seconds was that again?
For the moon picture, it was a 320th of a second.
Tap.
You're very welcome.
Hi, Nigel. Can you repeat what the details were for the Star Trails picture as well, please?
The Star Trails, yes, Star Trails. I think actually that was
the first one.
The first one. Oh, okay. Well, the first one of the star shot, that was 30 seconds at f/4, so the lens aperture wide open, and the ISO was 4000. For the second shot with the trails, that was 20 minutes with f/4, again lens aperture wide open, and 100 ISO.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Nigel, it's Mark. On the
Mark?
on the star trails, what was the name of the software you were using again?
Yeah, that was Deep Sky Stacker. I can never remember the name of it. I don't use it very often, but Deep Sky Stacker it's called. It's a free software. Seems to work quite well.
Cool, thank you.
And it's quite relatively straightforward to use as well. And there's lots of tutorials on the web, you might imagine.
Thank you very much. We'll have a look.
Sure.
Nigel, I'm going to have to leave you, I'm afraid, but it's absolutely great to see you still imparting your knowledge to so many people. More power to your elbow. And hopefully we'll meet up again pretty soon.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Tony. That's great.
Pleasure. All the best.
And you. Talk to you again soon. Bye.
Nigel, could you just go over the double timings for noise reduction? And you explained there was, if it was a 20-second or 20-second exposure, it's 20 seconds for the exposure plus 20 seconds for the noise reduction.
Right. Yeah, for the long exposure noise reduction. Yes. On my camera, I have that. Most cameras that I've looked at, obviously there are hundreds of models out there. I don't know them all by long way, but the few that I've looked at for the long exposure noise reduction usually have three settings. There's off, there's on all the time, and then there's auto. And auto means it switches on automatically for any exposure that is longer than 1 second. So what the camera does is it will obviously take your exposure, say it's 20-second exposure for the picture, but then it will then take another 20-second exposure, which doesn't expose the view, it just takes a photograph of the sensor to actually then just take a picture of the noise that sensor is generating. And then it can then put the two together and subtract the noise from the picture. That's the theory. It seems to work reasonably well.
I got that, but during the 20 seconds where it's essentially photographing the sensor, can you use the camera, or is it inoperable?
It's inoperable. Yeah,
right. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah. No, okay. So if you've got a 20-minute exposure, that's if you're doing actually the star trails, then you really are not going to get many pictures done unless you've got several cameras with you and several tripods.
One exposure, and then you're standing around twiddling thumbs, freezing
yourself to death. Yeah.
Right.
And can you move the camera while it's doing that?
Oh, yes. Yeah. You can do whatever you like. Well, do whatever you like.
You can shot. You can.
But you can't switch it off.
You can switch it off because it won't switch off. So. Yeah, if I don't switch it off, probably the best advice. You can pack it up. You can walk back to the car and make yourself a cup of tea, whatever. You can do whatever you like. The camera will just carry on taking that what's called dark field exposure. It doesn't matter. You can put the lens cap on. It doesn't make any difference to any of that at all. You know.
Got it.
So for this kind of thing, always have your high ISO noise reduction and your long exposure noise reduction switched on. So delve into your memories and hope that you have both. Though I think there are some cameras that only have one or the other. I'm not sure which, but hopefully your cameras will all have both facilities available. Okay. Anybody else got anything to say? Thank you for Wendy. Lots of written messages coming in. Okay, so if nobody else has got any questions, I'm going to close the meeting here. The next talk will be on the 24th of March, and it will be about wildlife photography, about mammals and birds. So that's what we'll be talking about then, hopefully. Well, definitely, there's no reason why that COVID is going to stop that. So that will happen. And I'll also let you all know in due course about what's going to happen about the low light photography course, which is probably not going to happen on 21st of March. So if you'd like to say all pack up now, and then we'll move on, and I'll see you in a month from now. A recording of this talk will go onto the web next week, and so you'll all be able to sort of look at it again if you want to. So I'll say good night and talk to you again soon. If you have any queries, just email me or phone me or whatever, and I'll do my best to help. Thank you very much. Good night.
Bye, Nigel.
Bye. 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 Bye.